Hi Jackie. So I am going to go through your code here and explain a few changes that I'm going to make that I see right off the bat. And I thought it would be a little bit easier if I actually verbally walked you through what I'm doing than try to explain it in an email. Because I think when you see what I'm going to do kind of position wise here with some things, it's going to make a lot more sense. So you have a really good start here. There's a few things that I want to point out right off the bat. So I'm using Sublime Text, which, like we said, does this color coding thing. And so my first thing I want to look at is, are any of these colors wrong? Is anything sticking out? So one that I see is right here. You'll notice that all throughout your whole document, your divs are in pink, and you have a div that's in green here. So you know something's up. So you want to say, well, what could it be? What near that might be doing something wrong? And the answer is actually right above it here. You closed your caret and then closed your quotes. So this inside caret, it's actually thinking as part of this name. So as far as this next div's concerned, it doesn't think you've actually closed this bracket here yet. So that's the first thing I'm going to change. We change that, and now this div turns pink. We also have the same thing happening up here. Div ID equals wrapper, and this one is green. Why? Let's look up one more, and body, so we close that. And so that's a really easy way when you're using a program like this to kind of look through it and say, like, right off the bat, is anything doing anything weird? So those are kind of the, before we even look at what we've created, let's look at our code and make sure that we don't see any errors in our code. And so I have your code right here and the layout right here, and I'm just going to kind of point back and forth to compare some things. You've done a really nice job identifying the sections, giving them a name that seems to make sense to you, and closing them over here. So what I'm going to do is kind of point out what you've done pretty well down here, but are missing a little up here. And that is keeping this idea of nesting in mind. And so what we did in class the other day, which actually seemed to help some people. There were a few people that were still just struggling a little bit with this idea of these sections. And the reason I'm dwelling on this so much, I know it seems like I keep talking about this and talking about this, but it's really the only thing there is to web design. So if we can get all of our sections broken up the right way and labeled the right way, we can manipulate them to do pretty much anything we want. And so when we get into our CSS and our CSS isn't working, usually it's not because the CSS isn't working, it's because we haven't dissected our website into building blocks well enough to actually be able to control what they're doing. So what I'm going to show you here is just kind of keeping what you did down here, this nesting experience going up here. And I'm glad that you put these little questions in here because actually I'm going to add a few more of them. We were adding them in class and that also seemed to help some people. So before I even start, I'm going to point out a couple things that some people said during class. So one thing that Jessica pointed out that she, watching the video about divs and floating, is that it clicked for her for the first time. And I know I've said this, but it's sort of conceptual, so I'm glad that it's sort of starting to click for people, is that when we say the box model, it's not really a box. It is because it's a space that has a top and a bottom and two sides. So it's a square or rectangular space, if you will, but there doesn't have to actually be a box there. And so that was something someone pointed out in class. She was like, "Oh, I just finally realized when you keep saying there doesn't have to be a box, you mean like it doesn't have to be a colored box or it doesn't have to be a box with a border. It's just an area shaped like a box." I was like, yes. So that's one kind of epiphany, if you will, that happened the other day in class. The other one was we went through, and I'm going to do the same thing to your code right here, but we went through and built our wireframe, if you will, first. And something that Amanda said was, wait a minute, should I always be building essentially my whole wireframe and code and then plugging the content in. I'm like, yeah, that's why we want you to do wireframes, because you're defining the sections for yourself ahead of time. You're telling yourself where everything's going to go and what you should call it and how it's going to be positioned. You don't have to put all the stuff in there. You can have, like you have right here, basically an empty wireframe, and as long as you label it well, you can come back and put your stuff in at any time, but you've spent the first, 20 minutes or so working on your website just building a skeleton. And so the analogy I used was, um, you know, if you don't have your actual skeleton to your human body, what's the point of putting clothes and makeup and stuff on if the skeleton's not there? So we can add all these flashy pictures and all these pretty colors and all that stuff, but if the structure is wrong, then we're making it harder to go through this. So I like that you've started to put all this structure here without actually worrying about the content. The content comes last. And so another thing I realized when Amanda said that is I think the reason that people are going backwards on that is because of the way textbooks work. So when you guys did the first level textbook, they teach you how to put in a picture, they teach you how to put in a paragraph, but nothing's really broken up because it's simple. It's a just a one little area website. Here's a photo, here's some text, here's a title. And then after that, they're like, okay, let's get more complicated. Let's break things up. So they're working off of an example that already had text, it already had pictures, and then they show you how to break it up. And that is kind of backwards of what I want you guys to think about. I want you guys to think about the structure of your website first, and you can put all the stuff in after. And so I know, and I keep saying, I'm telling you who had, made these comments, because obviously during class everyone would have heard it, so it's not a big deal. But Amanda was like, should I always be breaking it down like this? Because this is so much easier to understand where everything's supposed to go, and I can look at my code and know that it's all right first before it gets too busy. I'm like, yes, totally, you should totally be doing that. So, those are kind of the two things we talked about. So now I'm just going to kind of go through here and I'm going to kind of help you with what I think you are getting exactly right and what I think you have the right idea, but you're putting maybe in the wrong location. And so I know you have some in your document in the head styles of here, and that's okay. So I'm just going to scroll down. So we're at the beginning of the body tag. And the first thing you did was you wrapped everything in a wrapper. I don't think this matters, but I'm gonna do that just because visually it's a little easier for me not to have those spaces there. So you have div ID wrapper. And so that, my guess is your giant outside wrapper, which is containing everything. Perfect. So I'm going to also assume that this closing tag here is going to be the closing tag for your wrapper. And I'm going to keep those lined up together like this. I'm going to actually tab your footer in a little bit so it's not in line with your wrapper. First thing we talked about, and I know this was like killing some people with boredom, is use this tabbing system, especially Sublime Text. It literally gives you this line so that it's going down to your closing tag. And I know you're doing it here, which is great. Other thing we talked about, never, ever, ever, ever open a div without closing a div. And this would be way more obvious if you didn't already have all this stuff in the middle here. But the second we open something, we close it right away. So if this was brand new, I would do this, and then I would put my cursor in between, and I'd start putting my stuff there. But you already have stuff here, so I'm not going to do that. So then, great, we have our wrapper. That's our big outside part. And then you have this one div ID header. And so that is going to be this outside guy here. Again, I'm just going to adjust that a little bit. And so here is where you're going to catch yourself a little bit. So right here, you've done exactly what I just said. You closed your div right away, which is perfect. But then rather than putting your cursor in here, tabbing down, and putting your inside sections in the header, because these are in the header, and outside box, inside box. So we're thinking like the Russian nesting dolls, like the big mama on the outside, and then a smaller mama, and then a baby on the inside. So these, what I'm assuming, logo and nav, these actually belong inside this header. And so to just mentally tell us that, we're going to tab these over twice. So wrapper we know is the most outside. Header is in a little bit from that. I'm going to just do that so they close right down to each other. And then, actually, I guess that's not necessary. And then our logo section and our nav section are both within this header section. So that means that once I close my logo, once I close my navigation, I close my header section, and this whole top portion of my website is done, which is great. So now, like you did here, you could put an image logo in here, you could put a text logo in there. We can come into our nav here, and we'll just keep those nice and even, and we could start to build our list. I would never keep it over like this, though. I would always do something like that. Keep using this indenting system. Utilize it to your advantage. And so another thing we talked about was, and I'm not going to change this because I think it works for you, but one thing we talked about was being careful what we call sections. So like this one that you've called nav, we talked about maybe calling it menu. Why? Because nav is an actual thing in HTML. So nav is like a div, it's like a paragraph tag, it's like an image tag. And the reason we use this is for two reasons. One, accessibility. So if someone, say someone is blind and they're using an accessibility reader, it will identify that this is a navigation for them. Two, it will Google's web crawlers will be able to identify this as your menu very well. So they're not really looking as much at what you're calling your IDs, because your IDs can have like very random obscure names. Everybody comes up with something different. But this it notices. So if we call this nav and we call this nav, and then we're trying to call on this nav in our CSS and call this nav in our CSS, that's where we're going to get confused. So I'm going to rename this menu for you. Same thing, header. We could have an actual header in here. I'm going to close that if you want. Oops. We could do something like that. Do you have to? No. So you might call this, like, I think we had students each student naming a part, so I think Max called it like top bar or something like that. I'll leave it header for now, but just keeping in mind that some of these names are actual things within our structure, and that you know, we just don't want to confuse ourselves. So yes, you can name it anything you want, but just keep those thoughts in mind. All right, so now we have basically in this kind of flying V formation here, our whole top section of the website. So now just looking at my website, I now have one big box around this image. And so I think this is the section that you've called main here. I'm going to just move stuff up a little bit. I'm going to do that. I'll keep going. And I'm actually going to copy this for a minute, this comment. So I think it's easy to tell what things are by our opening tag, but it's hard to tell by our closing tag. So I'm going to put closes the menu. Here I'm going to put closes the header. And here I'm going to put closes the logo. And since I know it's already down here, closes the wrapper. and I'm going to keep doing this throughout here. So, and so now when we see one of these, we don't have to count up like, all right, how many, that one, or we see this, like this one here, and we're like, is that that one? Is that that one? Is that that one? We can just see, oh, this closes my logo. This closes my menu. And this closes my header. It's easy right now because there's no content. They're close together. But when things get spaced out down the page, these will be great little tags to keep yourself just on track. So here we have div ID main, and that is going to be this big guy here. So I'm going to say right here, closes main section. And you'll notice over here too that this main section is going to be in line with my header because they're on the same level of nesting. They're both right inside the wrapper, so I'm going to line them up on this left hand side like this. And so it closes main section, and then here we have div ID inner wrapper. And so I see your little note here, this would contain the photo. So actually, we are not going to need that section at all. So I think for some reason we had the main and the inner wrapper. I think you did this as if there were two boxes here, I think is what you did, but actually you closed one before you opened the other. So what would happen is this inner wrapper would actually be a space that's in between this photo and this section. It would be almost like a third section wedged in between these two. So we're going to get rid of that totally. And then I like your question here. So then I would add the content here after the full column. Let me get rid of your question, just keep your text clean here. And so full column, I'm going to answer your question. Full column is, I think, what you're calling this box that's wrapping all your columns. That's totally okay name. And this right here, I think, is your closing tag for that. So we're going to say closes full call. And let me move these guys up a little bit, and I'm going to indent these because, again, we're nesting. So now you've done this perfectly. You have your div ID of full column, and within that you have a section called events, a section called connect, and a section called rate experience. I am going to see how you have a space here. We don't want a space there. So I'm just going to shorten this for you with a hyphen. Rate exp. And you've closed all three, so that's perfect. I'm going to do this for you because you'd have to do it anyway. And then I'm going to label these to keep us. So when we put our stuff in, we're not confused. So let's put 3 of these. This closes events. Closes connect. And closes rate exp. Alright, so you actually had this section, you had, an extra section up here, but this section you had perfect. So you have your big wrapper around all three, and then you have 1, 2, 3, we can even space these out a little to make it easier to see. And again, these are at the level of our menu and our logo, nesting wise. We close our full column. Now you've done here a footer. What I'm actually going to have you do, and so this footer is kind of like what I was saying, this nav. So it's like it's an actual tag in HTML. And so what I'm actually going to have you do is, even if you're using this footer, we're still going to wrap it in a div. So I'm going to call it, footer wrapper, because you're going to have a footer in it. So I'm going to wrap it in something called footer wrapper. And closes footer wrapper. Make sure to tab that over. I'm going to just tab your footer in a little bit. And this is totally okay to have your footer within your div. So now we have two options here. So we can control footer wrapper. We can also control footer. So it's just giving us more things we can style. Do you even have to have this? No, you could totally get rid of that. Can you have it if you like having it? Oops. If you like having it there? Yes, definitely. And then, yep, this is perfect. So inside icon footer, and that's your little guy here. Why did we even wrap that? Why do we have an inside footer here? Well, because we're going to make it, let's see, about probably 33% width, float it to the right, and center everything in it. So we don't want to do that to the whole footer. If we centered everything in the whole footer, it would be right here. If we floated it to the right, but it was 100% width, it still would look the same. If we did 30% width on the whole footer and floated it to the right, the green would end here, and that would be weird too. So we're styling this footer wrapper with this green background, and we're styling this inside footer wrapper with this center and float right. And you've closed that, so I'm just going to give you a label. Closes inside footer. Oops, inside icon. Whoops, icon footer. And you can space this out or keep it close together, whatever works for you. We close our wrapper, we close our body, we close our HTML. So now, that wasn't a ton of changes I made. I marked some of these things, what it's closing, and I moved a few items, but basically you've kind of had almost everything in the right place. Just keep things close together until I just keep them touching until I put something in them. I also definitely want to emphasize lining stuff up in these columns, but also kind of spacing stuff out. Stuff doesn't need to like touch all the time. Some people's code, it all like touches in a big paragraph. That's hard to read. So I think just kind of spacing stuff out makes it a little easier to read. Label your closing tags so you can make sure you have them all. And hopefully that helps. I'm going to save a copy of this and send it back to you. But overall, you did a really nice job, and you were like 95% of the way there. It was just a few tweaks. Let me know if you have any questions.